All right, so welcome everybody. First off, it's thrilled to be speaking for the Northeast Ohio chapter. I've done speaking for a lot of different chapters around the world. I've never spoken for you guys before, so I'm thrilled to have had the invite. I am, my official title, literally my official title, it is on my business card, is President and Chief Organizational Therapist of Interthink Consulting Incorporated. I've been a member of PMI since 1992. Wow, that's like 30 years now. That's frightening. And I was on the executive of the Southern Ontario chapter in Toronto. I was president and then past president for a ridiculous amount of time of the Northern Alberta chapter in Alberta, funnily enough, in Edmonton, and now call Ontario on the north side of Lake Erie home. So I'm actually relatively proximate to you guys as well. And what we're going to talk about today is on storytelling, which is, it's a really fun presentation to do because as project managers, we think in process and we think in structure and we think in Gantt charts and risk assessments and RACI charts and structure and scope and work breakdown structures. And yet what drives our ability to actually be able to get things done, and particularly in order to be able to get support, to be able to advocate for a perspective, to get buy-in from a project sponsor, to be able to support the change management process with our various stakeholders that are needing to be able to understand and use and implement and embrace whatever it is that our projects are producing, we need to convey the importance, the desirability, the value, the resonance. We need to tell them stories. And what's really interesting is, like, if you actually go and read the guide to the PMBOK, and I'm guilty of actually having done that more than once, it doesn't talk about story. It talks about communications. We'll talk about some of what the PMBOK actually talks about in terms of communication. But the idea that we tell stories for a living, and we do, doesn't actually come up. And so what I want to do is actually, I want to start with a story. And so if you'll indulge me for just a couple of seconds, I'm going to relate the story of a consultant who will be, he will remain nameless, but there once was a young man, could have been a woman, but in this instance is a young man, who's working as a consultant and was working really, really hard early on in his career, just coming up the corporate ladder to be credible, wanting to figure out how to dress, how to carry himself in meetings, how to be able to communicate with others, and particularly because consultants do this a huge amount of their lives, how to present. And so there was a fundamental belief from his perspective in terms of how he'd been taught, in terms of what he did well in terms of school, in terms of how he perceived the world and structured what he valued in terms of stuff, that what was important in terms of presenting and communicating was about data. And so one day he started off a key presentation and presented the data, walked through the calculations, worked to be able to demonstrate how and why, and with credibility, why the data was important and why the calculations were correct and why the data then advocated for an overall perspective. And the thing that he recognized very early on is he didn't actually have his audience. The questions that got asked were critical. They were challenging, they were nitpicking, and they weren't about what he wanted to present. They weren't about what, in his view, it was important to be able to talk about. It was going down tangents and rabbit holes and really struggling to be able to get him back to being able to navigate and get to a conclusion, and particularly get the support and buy-in that he needed in order to be able to be successful. And so he doubled down. He went to his backup slides. He went through additional details. Someone yawned. Afterwards, his vice president pulled him aside, and he knew the presentation hadn't gone well. He thought he was about to be fired. And what the VP said after the presentation was, look, you know what you're doing. They know you know that as well. That's why you're in the room. When they started asking questions, they were toying with you. They were bored. You became the mouse. You'll always have the data. You know that, I know that, they know that too. What they want is the story. Now, that was really hard advice for this person to hear. Story didn't come easy. The story didn't fit within a worldview that said, this is what business presentations are about. And he fervently believed that the data should tell the tale, that people should want to see all the detail. They should be confident in the detail when they're making decisions. But he tried. And slowly he learned how to be able to build story and how to relate story. And it was difficult at first. Did not at all come easily or naturally, but eventually he got there. Today he runs his own consulting company, and he never forgets the advice that his mentor gave him. In fact, he shares it with his new employees on a regular basis. Now, that may be a true story. It may be apocryphal. I suspect it had your attention. And that's kind of the point, because what we're really talking about when we talk about story is how we communicate effectively. And what we get taught about communication, particularly in the guide to the project management body of knowledge, what we get tested on when we do our PMP exam is this model that's on the screen right now. We talk about the fact that there is in communication a sender that encodes a message that is communicated through a medium that is filtered through noise until it's received by the receiver, and they decode said message. And then the receiver encodes a reply that is again provided as feedback through some medium that must be filtered through noise until it's received by the sender and decoded, and hopefully what the message was actually intended. And none of this is wrong. But none of this really gets to the heart of what actually matters when we communicate, when we tell story, when we advocate, when we persuade, when we actually build and secure and maintain buy-in, which is the content. Because what's really interesting about this particular model is the content is shown as a line. It's a thing like, this is the message that you're sending. And it basically perceives all content as actually being equal. And it's not. It is not equal in terms of importance, and it is not equal in terms of structure, and it is not equal in terms of what it means. And so what we've got to do is be able to understand what makes compelling content, because content is critical. And this is the thing, not all content is actually created equally. And so what we need to know is, how do we actually create good and compelling content that people are actually going to want to hear? And so when we think about tests of effective content, it's, if we ask the question, how do we know our content is effective? A big question is, what should we be looking for in terms of how making sure that message that does get communicated across that line is actually relevant, is meaningful, is appropriate, is understandable. And this is the thing, to be effective, content needs, first and foremost, to be able to reach its audience. More importantly than that, though, our audience needs to, and they need to want to pay attention, which means you need to capture them, you need to keep them, and you need to make them want to hear what it is you have to say. And the essentials of truly effective content basically come down to 4 overall criteria. It needs to be heard, it needs to be accepted, it needs to be actionable, and above all, it actually needs to be matter. It needs to matter. Now, delivery is also important. How we communicate that content. And this is where we get into a whole different dimension, because there's an art to effective delivery. There are rules, and there's structure, and there's guidance, but fundamentally there is art. Because when we're delivering, what we're trying to do is be able to convey, first off, that we have actually a level of passion, that we actually care enough to want to tell a story. Because if you're not conveying the importance and your enthusiasm, your meaning behind it, you're in no way going to be able to get buy-in and interest from anybody else. If you've ever watched somebody deliver a joke completely deadpan, it can be the funniest joke in the world, but unless told with a level of animation and commitment, and to a certain extent, humor unto itself, it's going to fall flat. It's not going to land. It's not going to get the laugh. And so we need, as presenters, to be able to care about our audience. we need to meet them where they are. And we need to, in doing that, be able to deliver in an engaging way, because we need them to be attentive to us. We need them to know we are attentive to them. And the magic of all of that is getting to the point where a spark is ignited that they actually buy into and engage with and follow. And in particular, start to anticipate where this is going. And so part of narrative, part of story is a level of mystery. It's a level of there is unresolved tension they are waiting to find out the answer to. And it's unresolved tension they're waiting to find the answer to because they're already speculating where this is going and they want to know if they're right or not. If you can get them there, you have them in the palm of your hand and they will follow you where you lead them. And that is the mark and the measure of an effective storytelling. And so how do we know our delivery is effective? What should we be looking for in terms of approaching the delivery of our content? Delivery basically needs to engage. And what that means is it needs to be true-ish. And this is the thing, the story that I told you as we started this presentation, it sounds true, could be real. Based on the details that I told you, it could be autobiographical. It might be about me. And at the same time, it might not. I'm not telling you the answer to that. But if it's plausible enough, if it's believable enough, if it tells a story in a way that's meaningful, that's relatable, that is engaging, that is empathetic, that speaks to universal truths, people will listen and people will engage and people will want to follow and find out where it goes because they want a satisfying conclusion and they want to be able to satisfy the mystery of, is my anticipation of where this is going in line with what's actually happening? And so what we have to do is be able to make communication matter. That is our overall goal. It has to connect. It has to prompt. And by prompt, what's important to be able to understand there is what constitutes prompt in terms of people wanting to be able to pay attention. There needs to be basically one of three things. People in caring need to see there is sufficient pain, there is sufficient inspiration, or there is sufficient benefit for me to be able to gain by actually following this presentation. If they can see that, if they can viscerally feel it, they absolutely will. And so what you're basically responding to, the essence of good story is kind of like how drama works, plays in theater. There are comedies and there are tragedies. The way good story works is it responds to one of two key fundamental emotional drivers of human being. It either speaks to fear or it speaks to aspiration. And there's a reason why, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, you might care to be able to present in the context of one versus the other. And here's a really interesting thing. You can present a story, the same story, from either of those different perspectives based on the data that you select, based on the narrative that you craft, and based on how you actually choose to tell the tale. I can tell a story about a business decision that has a happy ending, and I can also tell one that has a negative ending about exactly the same decision based on how I select and structure and present the data, and more particularly how I craft the story around the data that actually draws on. And that actually engages with people's fundamental biases in terms of how they think and respond to information, which means the way that you structure it will have a significant influence on whether they actually ultimately do buy in, accept, and go along with the conclusions that you recommend. And so what that brings us to is really the importance of story and where we actually come in terms of being able to look for this. And what's important to recognize is that as human beings, I mentioned as we were just chatting at the beginning, we are hardwired for story. It is what we are built to convey. It is how we have communicated. If you look at the traditions of early cultures, it's all built around story. The rules of the native Mohawk Indians are related by story that is encoded, the meaning of which is encoded in beaded belts. And it's by following the beads and knowing the structure and remembering the sequence of what's told that lore is handed down literally from generation to generation over dozens and hundreds and thousands of years, and still has meaning today, even for stories that were crafted thousands of years ago. And we're hardwired for story in a number of different ways. First off, story is about people. And so we relate to story because we crave meaning, we crave social contact, we crave social interactions. Why, when we come into a presentation like this, we want to be able to socialize, connect, because we want to be able to connect as human beings. What story allows us to do is be able to do that and do that well. Story fundamentally drives our nervous system. Our brains are built around story. And science has actually demonstrated watching engaging, really good movies, gripping, thrilling, funny, whatever, versus non-engaging, not fun, not enjoyable movies. Fundamental degrees of difference in terms of the chemical composition of our brains as they actually respond to the visceral experience of what's happening. And so our brains basically transmit cortisol, which is our fear response. It is about dealing with tense moments that is fundamentally designed to be able to allow us to focus because we feel tension. Our brains literally focus us in. It gives us chemicals to be able to pay attention to what is happening here. And we also have oxytocin, which is the feel-good chemical, the warm and happy fuzzies that we get when we get a story well told. So if you went and saw You've Got Mail, if your Christmas tradition, for example, is watching White Christmas, that wonderful feeling you get at the end of it, that is oxytocin taking over your brainstem and making you feel that beautiful, warm, happy, loving feeling as you go into the holidays. And the story of the movie is designed, literally designed, to give you that response. And so when you're thinking about story, we're thinking about how do we craft and structure it in order to be able to elicit that response, encourage that response, maximize the likelihood that we're going to inspire that response. We've been telling stories since there was a campfire to tell stories around. It's how we connect, it's how we relate, it's how we communicate, it's how we function. If you go on, we're in the middle of summer right now, if you go on a camping trip with family or with friends, with loved ones, I recognize the Venn diagram that is not necessarily completely overlapping. And you gather around the campfire. Hopefully you're not all looking at your phones. In the reality, you're engaging with each other. And in many cases, what you're doing is you're relating the stories of your lives and your experiences and things that have happened and the dreams that you have and the aspirations that you hold, because that's how we connect. That's how we actually create meaning. And here's the thing, back to where we started this morning or this evening. Facts are boring. We are hardwired, particularly if we actually go through any level of business education, to say facts are necessary, that we should be making rational, logical, reasoned decisions. And yet the reality is, as human beings, for most of us, facts are not compelling. We think logic should be compelling, but it's not. And the challenge is that when we actually look as project managers about what we actually use and how we actually structure information, all of our tools are actually built around facts: project charters, business cases, status reports, risk registers, schedules, budgets. It's all data. It's all isolated facts that we are expecting somebody to be able to look at, infer meaning from, and then take appropriate action based upon that. And the likelihood of them actually doing it, as many of us have seen empirically through real life experiences, is much less than we would actually like to do. Business cases are stories about a possible future. Status reports are stories about an existing reality. And what we've got to do is be able to, and the thing that people should read most is, and the thing people should take the most time to craft is the narrative of how to be able to do that. And that's not the long, boring, exhausting list of this is everything that we've accomplished. It's finding a way to be able to craft 2 and 3 or 4 or at most 5 sentences that grip, that engage, that capture the attention and guide and prompt in terms of this is where we are and this is what it means, and therefore this is what I need you to do. And the big challenge with all of this is writing short, clear, simple, and compelling is a great deal more work and requires a huge amount more effort than writing something exhaustive. To create a good, compelling 1 or 1.5 page summary of a project will take me hours, sometimes days, versus if I have to actually produce a 50-page project charter. I can do that in my sleep. I can do that probably in the space of a morning. Distilling that down to, though, a summary that I both want and need people to read, that they should actually want to read, that actually can take several days to be able to do well. It's incredibly difficult to write short and compelling clearly, but it's absolutely necessary to be able to do. Because stories fundamentally are interesting. Life happens in the narratives that we tell each other. And when we relate to something, then we actually start to care. And that's what we're actually trying to tap into when we tell a story. We're trying to root for the underdog. We care that the couple lives happily ever after. We cheer when the monster gets slain. We're overjoyed when the team comes from behind and actually wins a victory, especially if they're our team. And these things happen in our work lives as well. And this is the thing, finding the inner story makes the difference. It allows us to be able to build support and engagement and interest, and ultimately commitment in terms of being able to move forward. So if we want people to take action, fundamentally, first off, they actually have to care, and we need to be able to get them to care. And so some fundamentals around that: they need to be engaged, they need to feel interesting, they need to feel interested and compelled, and they need to care enough to, based on that story, actually do something. Now, we implicitly recognize this. We recognize that in the rhetoric of how business cases are presented in terms of what another company does. When we look at benchmarking, for example, there's much more story than there is data in terms of why a particular practice works or is effective or is meaningful. And so what we need to do as project managers, as business people, as strategic advisors to our senior managers, we need to actually explicitly embrace it. We need to supplement our tools, and we need to interpret the stories, craft the stories that the data actually relates. What story is doing is helping them to know what to carry about. Stories are really instrumental because in a number of ways, they function beyond emotional connection. They focus attention, they advocate, and they do, and this is important, they advocate for a particular view. Stories have an intended outcome and conclusion. They select the details that actually support that view. And this is also important to acknowledge, they omit the aspects that don't necessarily serve the story. So the focus at the end is crystallized and focused and precise and designed to take your audience where you need them to go. Now, you can listen to that and say, well, hang on, that's manipulation. Yes, it absolutely is. Stories are biased, and that's the point. Stories take a position. And the really interesting thing is that bias plays a role in story. There is no room in an effective story for wishy-washy. There is no room in effective story for dissembling. You're supposed to know where stories stand. And so story does take a position. And the key for then the audience is to understand and define where they stand relative to the actual story, because stories shape how we actually perceive. And the choice is figuring out the presentation frame based on how it's going to be responded to. There's been a lot of work done around decision-making biases. Two of the absolute giants in terms of the field of understanding cognitive biases in decision-making were Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. And their research going back to the 1960s and 70s ultimately is what won Daniel Kahneman the Nobel Prize for Economics, understanding how our brains process and fundamentally are manipulated or fooled by data and how it's presented. For example, as human beings, we are incredibly risk averse. And so if, for example, we have won some money, instantly our minds go to how to protect and preserve that wealth, even if we didn't have it 20 minutes before. If we are losing, however, if we're behind, our minds go much more to an appetite for risk to be able to double down and try to be able to win it back. And so we are more risk prone in the face of loss than we are in the face of gains. And this is a fundamental strategy in terms of thinking about how to present a business case, because business cases can actually be written and crafted based upon net positive impacts or net negative impacts. If you want people to take a risky decision, presenting it in the context of what could be lost as a consequence of not is much, much more likely to generate that response than presenting it in the context of gains that can be maintained. If you want people to be cautious, if you want them to avoid a risky decision, presenting the business case in the context of gains and not losses is much, much more likely to be able to lead to that outcome. But what we're basically doing is we are manipulating. We are taking a position absolutely genuinely and forthrightly and without apology. We have a belief, we have a conclusion, we are not being objective, we are being biased, and we are with the story telling the bias we think is important, where the decision makers still absolutely have freedom to be able to choose, do they stand with that or not, but to understand where they stand on it. And so if we want to be able to tell effective stories, what we need to do is be able to hone our craft. Now, what story is ultimately doing, the point of story, what it does is it is about illustrating a process of transformation. It is about engaging your attention. It's about drawing you into a compelling situation. It's about being able to produce a successful resolution. In other words, the fundamental art of storytelling has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. And part of the point of structure is that we actually understand that. We may not understand it explicitly. We may never have been taught the structure of an effective story, but we know what it is. Intuitively, we understand what we should expect when someone starts telling a story. We don't know the specifics. We don't know how it's going to play out, but what engages us is partly driven by the curiosity of how is this going to evolve? Where is it going to go? Where are you actually trying to take me? So the essential structure of story is really simple. There is a setup. There is a beginning introduction where we have to introduce a situation and our characters and the environment that they're actually in. And from there, we create conflict. Story requires tension. Story requires something that is unresolved, that is difficult, that is complicated, that is painful, that needs to be brought to some conclusion. And then at the end of it, there is some level of resolution. One brilliant soul basically described the essential structure of story as basically you introduce your character, you drive them up a tree and throw rocks at them, and then by the end, you safely get them down from the tree. That is what we're trying to do. This is the basic 3-act structure of how all narrative is created. I don't care if you're talking about a book. I don't care if you're talking about a movie. I don't care if you're talking about a play. Every single one of them, I don't care if you're talking about a campfire. Every single one of those stories done well follows that structure. This presentation follows that structure. Every single presentation I do in the Project Headway webinar series for projectmanagement.com follows that structure deliberately. There is always an introduction, there is a discussion of the specific challenges in the presentation of the problem, and then there is a presentation of the resolution and approach and narrative of where I'm trying to take you in terms of where that needs to go. And there's a nice summary at the conclusion to be able to say, here's what I told you, and here's what it means, and here's what I would want you to, if nothing else, remember out of having been here as you go on your merry way again at the top of the hour. Every single presentation done well follows this structure: setup, conflict, resolution. We introduce what's happening, the situation occurs, which creates tension and suspense, that conflict is ultimately addressed, and the story gets closed. Now, you might be asking, well, hang on, what about this hero's journey that I've heard about? So yeah, keep your armor on, because that still fits what we're talking about. And if the suit of armor fits, you should probably wear it. The hero's journey, which comes from Campbell, is by and large 3-act structure with better marketing. You have a hero that is called to a quest. They overcome obstacles that test their resolve. They finally gain the object of their desire in triumph, or they lose it all in tragedy. And I would invite you to look at the storyline of, let's see, Star Wars, The Princess Bride. Where else might we go with this? Just about any of them, really. Those are going to be my 2 big ones that I land on right now. Basically follows that overall process of the Lord of the Rings. Now, it does that over a very long period of time, but you've basically got the same thing. You have Frodo called to a quest. You have the rest of the book is all the obstacles that must be overcome and by which they must be tested as they finally verge on Mordor. And then finally the triumph that they attain by realizing the object of their desire, or in this case, the loss of the ring. The essence is exactly the same three-act structure. It's featured everywhere from, as I said, the Princess Bride to the Lord of the Rings. And so we can expand that journey as well. There is a structure that's called Freytag's Pyramid. It's a slightly different take. It's often used by playwrights because it is the essence of the five-act structure of dramatic theater that basically says in Act 1, you have exposition, which is the inciting moment that is, once again, the setup. You have in Act 2 complications, you have rising action, you have presenting of the tensions and the problems and the difficulties. And then Act 3, the climax, the turning point. This is where we want to find out what happens. This is the critical battle. This is the ultimate scene of resolving the tension, often drawn out for an extended period of time until you get to reversal, the falling action, and ultimately the end, the denouement, the moment of release, and they live happily ever after. And what's interesting is this is not an equally distributed timeline. What you often have is Acts 1, 2, and 3 that basically take the bulk of the overall story. 4 and 5 are rounded out at the end as overall resolution and can actually happen relatively quickly. But it's again speaking to the emotional instances that occur all along the way in terms of being able to get from beginning to end. There's also the story spine. Now, this gets often attributed to Pixar, and so the movie company, and what was identified as their 22 rules of storytelling. This is most popularized, although it wasn't originated, by Brian McDonald. If you want to understand story, I would absolutely encourage you, write down and Google later 22 rules of storytelling, or Pixar's 22 rules of storytelling. It is brilliant. It is short. There are only 22 of them. We told you that in the title, but some really incredible and valuable guidance. And you will find also some narratives around that that explain how they actually get applied and used in any number of stories that Pixar creates, whether that is about The Incredibles or whether that is about Toy Story or any of the other movies that they've actually created. And it's another, and what they offer within that, the story spine is another really useful framework to be able to think about story structure, because this is how every single Pixar movie actually unfolds. It starts basically with once upon a time there was, fill in the blank. We're introducing our character, we're introducing our situation, we're introducing the environment in which they're contained, and we're creating routine. And every day something happens until one day, blank, tension gets introduced. A change has occurred. There's a problem now that needs to be resolved. And then it escalates. This is the rising tension we were talking about in Freytag's Pyramid. And because of this, blank, this happened. And then because of this, blank, this happened. And you can then repeat that as necessary for as many instances as required in order to be able to get to the overall conclusion until finally, blank, this was the culmination and the resolution. And ever since that day, blank, this is how the story ended, and they lived happily ever after. This is the essential spine. It is literally the narrative arc that every single Pixar movie follows. And you can go and rip apart and be able to identify scene by scene what the once upon a time was, what the everyday was, what the spark of until one day was, and then the 5, 12, 15, 25 different, and because of this, this happened, until finally you get to the resolution, and then peace and happiness and moving on. Now, a slightly alternative take on this, slightly anarchic take, is Aristotle's rules of conveying, convincing, persuasion, basically. And what he identified, and this goes back several millennia now, is that every act of persuasion has three components to it: ethos, pathos, and logos. And what ethos speaks to is establishment of your credibility. It's creating of an environment of trust. It's establishing that you are legitimately allowed to and able to tell this story because you have the experience, the credibility, the track record, the history in order to be able to do that. Pathos is not about you, it's about your audience. It's about developing and demonstrating an understanding of their needs, showing them that you know and have familiarity with their situation, showing that in essence, you feel their pain. And then logos is conveying the logic of your solution, compelling them to take action. And so this was structured as the rules of persuasion and being able to convince anybody of the logic of a particular position. Now, again, you need to then evaluate and understand, how do you stand relative to this story? But this is a good way to be able to craft the story. Since I was introduced to this, and I was introduced to this in a really, really fabulous, relatively short book, still in print, called The Art of Persuasion, highly recommended. Ever since I was introduced to this in essence is the backbone of every single proposal that I write as a consultant. The structure of my proposals is absolutely uniform. I introduce the problem that I'm trying to solve. So I provide some background and I identify what overall customer requirements are. So what I'm demonstrating is pathos. I appreciate who they are and the challenges they're experiencing, and a strategic discussion of what that means and the problems it creates, and the desired outcomes they actually have as an organization or a client or a prospective client. I have ethos, the information about this is who we are as an organization. This is who I am as a consultant. This is my track record in terms of what I've done. These are the kinds of clients that I've worked for. These are the sorts of solutions that I've been able to create. Being able to demonstrate then the credibility and the logic and the argument of what that actually means. And then it gets into, and this is the proposed approach. And it starts with an overall narrative to say, and a solution to this would look like these overall key stages. That then gets into the details of, and this is what it would mean in terms of activity, in terms of schedule, in terms of deliverables, in terms of costs, and then ultimately rounds out with, and this is the value of the approach and why we think we're an awesome person, why I'm an awesome person or we're an awesome organization to be able to do this work for you. But every single proposal that I put out has built into it the essence of this structure: ethos, pathos, logos. Incredibly useful structure to be able to think about when you need to persuade, when you need to convince, what needs to be inside as content in order to be able to do that. And it's not about choosing any one of these overall structures. The 3X structure and Freytag's pyramid, they actually kind of seamlessly blend together. The idea of story spine gives you slightly different way of narrative or narrating that helps to be able to craft, and what words do I use? But what this speaks to, ethos, pathos, and logos, is, well, what words need to be inside of that? What content do I need to speak to? What do I need to be able to demonstrate in order to be able to get the buy-in and the encouragement and the acceptance and the desire to be able to move forward? You also need to know your arc. You need to know where you're beginning, and you need to know where you're trying to end, and you need to know what your desired landing is. Because from there, your problem solving is going, how do I get from one place to the other? And what are the stages that I need to build in? What has to happen here or here or here in order to be able to get to the end? And the biggest problem in terms of being able to craft story and structure is that problems that happen at the end usually actually get created at the beginning. It's how we actually set up, or it's how we fail to set it up in order to be able to get to a reasonable finish line. So you absolutely need to know your starting place. You absolutely need to know the finishing point you need your audience to get to by the end of the story. And you need to know how to be able to then convey in a logical, compelling, reasoned way from one end to the other, from the start to the overall finish. Now, as we've talked about, tension is essential because this is how people actually get engaged. People want to know what happens. You have to want them to know what happens. And so what they're going to be doing, and you need to be building in, is they need to be actively looking for clues. If you ever read a mystery novel, the reason people like mysteries is not because murders happen and crimes get committed, at least for most people. It's because in telling the story of that, people know, again, based on the structure of this is how good mysteries are written, that at the end, they're going to find out who done it. Not only are they going to find out who done it, they're going to find out how it was done and why it was done and what the clues were that the detective or the protagonist followed in order to be able to figure out the whodunit. And the reason people love mystery is A, they want to be surprised, but B, even more than that, they want to be able to get it right. They want to be able to spot and pick up the clues. They want to feel the thrill of, I think that I know this, where this is going. I think this is a sign that this occurred here. And what's really fun is that, yes, they like it when they write, but they like it even more when they're wrong. When all of a sudden something comes together, when a conclusion is arisen, it's like, I did not see that coming. All the clues were there, but I didn't anticipate the ending was going to end quite the way that it was. And it's it's the tension of trying to figure out where it goes, where it's going to go, before we actually get told in real life. And so we want to anticipate, but we also appreciate the unexpected. And that unexpected, again, needs to be plausible. The seeds need to have been planted. And then ultimately, there's just enough that those seeds grow in a slightly unexpected way. Empathy is equally critical. This goes back to the idea of ethos in Aristotle's structure, that you need to be able to relate to your audience. Your characters need to be relatable. And that's baked into how we react to every story. If we don't like the character, we often very much shut down on the story itself. We can't relate, we can't connect, we have no interest, or worse, we actually hope something horrible befalls them because we just don't like who they are. One of the things that it took me a very long time to realize about story is you need to show, not tell. The narrator is not a useful feature of good story. You need to be able to create a picture. You need to be able to show an image. You need to be able to provide instances and examples that allow your audience to be able to, from that, infer the meaning and the conclusion. It's not telling them what they need to think. It's presenting the information in a compelling way that they are led to think that, where you're leaving the work to them in order to be able to do it. You're not spoon feeding them. You're not giving them the answers. You're not telling them what they need to do. You're feeding the information in a way that they are engaged and anticipating and listening and connecting and making the inferences for themselves, because that's when you will most get the buy-in, not because you told them it was a good idea, because they came to the conclusion it was a good idea based on the story you told. That is a fundamentally different outcome you need to be working to. Good story, you need to be brief, you need to be bright, you need to be gone. It needs to be short. You need to take as long as you need, but you need to take absolutely no longer. What you are trying to do is you're trying to capture attention. And so brevity here is both an advantage and a gift. As I said, it takes an incredible amount of discipline and focus to be able to tell a good story well, simply, and with simplicity. Being able to do that takes effort, it takes work, it takes craft, and there's value in taking the time and effort to be able to do that. So it's just enough that people understand what's happening, they understand where it's going, and they can relate to the characters, they can fill in the gaps, they can show for themselves what it means and infer from that, and be able to go from there. And ultimately, storytelling is about problem solving. It's about choosing the character, it's about choosing the structure, it's about choosing what details do you need to include, and also what are the ones that you either need to or just should omit because they don't further where it is you need to go. You need to choose the lens that you're going to look through. You need to choose the lens you're going to show the story through. Is this about positive? Is it about negative? Is it about hope? Is it about tragedy? Is it about potential gains? Or is it about the risk of losses? And there's got to be a reason why you choose that particular narrative. Going back to the idea of cognitive biases that we talked about at the beginning. You need to be clear about the rules that you're following, and you need to actually ideally follow the rules. The reason structure works is because it works. And it's only once you've actually mastered the rules that you can then feel confident about breaking them, because in a particular situation or context, they actually don't serve you well, and it's appropriate to be able to break them. But ultimately, story is about choice. It's about selecting, including what's going to make a difference. And it's also about identifying and leaving out what's not going to make a difference. And so this is all about the challenge that you have in terms of being able to say, what's the narrative that I create and how do I fit it within a structure? And what are the essential details that actually do create meaning, and make a difference and provide value, and what doesn't. Story is also about listening. And it's about thinking about how we listen. It's about being able to deconstruct as necessary back to what needs to be able to be heard and what needs to be able to be conveyed and what your audience needs to hear for themselves so that they can actually come to the conclusions that you need them to. And so in order to wrap up, some conclusions and takeaways. As I said, this follows storytelling structure exactly. I gave you an introduction. I set up the problem. I discussed the challenges. I then provided solutions and guidance and specifics, and then ultimately wrap up with some conclusions and takeaways. And that is, and the big one is that we fall prey to a fundamental deception in the world that we think the world responds to logic, and we think the world responds to data. And we assume that the more data that we have, the more that we structure that, the more that we demonstrate our thinking, the more that we talk through our analysis, the more compelling that is actually going to be. And the reality is that is simply not true. The more data that you provide, the more analysis you take them through, it's not about then showing the confidence of your thinking. You are actually boring them to tears. What people respond to, what everybody responds to, is narrative. We are hardwired to respond to story. Our nervous system genuinely brings us along and shapes how we respond. It amplifies how we respond based upon what we're hearing and how we're feeling. And it literally builds in ongoing reinforcing feedback to that. The more that is tension, the more that there is risk, the more that there is fear, the more that there is cortisol, the more that we're going to focus and pay attention because there is threat, there is danger, there is attentiveness that's necessary. And the more that there's happiness, the more that there is light, the more that there is successful and positive resolution, the more of that happy, wonderful, feel-good chemical of oxytocin courses through our system, giving us the warm fuzzy of this is right, this is good, this makes sense, this is appropriate. Which of those you need to be able to drive depends upon the situation, depends on the required outcome, it depends on the problem that you're trying to solve, it depends on the story that you need to relate, and it particularly depends upon where do you need your audience to be able to get to at the end. And if you want them to get to the end where what you get is action, where you get response, where you get commitment, where you actually get people to change attitude and behavior, fundamentally they need to care. Logical arguments are not going to take you there. And in fact, it will put many of them to sleep. Story is your secret to unlocking attention and knowing the secrets of story, the structure of story, the crafting of story is your means of being able to do that consistently and reliably and well. Because good story benefits from structure. It benefits from specifics. It benefits from speaking into what people expect to hear, giving them the structure they implicitly know they should expect, feeding them the details that they know they need to be looking for in order to be able to figure out for themselves, where is this going and what does this mean and how do we relate to it and what do I actually do with it? And so it benefits from themes that, while are specific to a situation, are also universally and broadly applicable. Because if we can relate it back to us, we can bring analogy, we can bring experience, we can bring the benefit of hindsight and say, this one's like that one. We know how that one went. That didn't go the way we had hoped. We need to do differently here. And it's by taking the particulars and weaving those into the universal truths and the universal stories and the universal narratives that we'll actually be able to create that outcome. And this is ultimately the goal. We need to all recognize project managers, as strategists, as strategic advisors to our clients, as employees of our organizations, as consultants, we are first and foremost storytellers. And so what we need to do is be able to figure out how to tell a good story. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. We'll open for the question either by chat or by open mic. And
absolutely.
I'm gonna steal the sharing and I will share.
I love the comment that Todd make. I think it was as I was telling my story. And was that consultant named Mark? Again, I'm not telling you that.
Sharing. So while we're looking to the chat and the questions, I just quickly will back. This is the code or PDU claim code for this presentation. I'll keep it on the screen, or I'll back to it quickly. This is our website, Northeast Ohio Chapter website. You can navigate in the website, look to the new events that we have. We have coming events. We have in-person events coming in August. We have the International Project Management Day coming in November, and we have a few events in September and October as well. And this is how to keep up with your BDU. BDU, one of them is projectmanagement.com. I think Mark, you are presenting there, I think monthly, as you said.
I am indeed.
Yep. And yeah, I'll back to this claim code. I'll keep it on the screen for a little bit of time. And let me.
Yeah, we've got one question that's come in from Todd. It's a really, really great one. So I actually want to take a bit of time to respond to it. And he asks, how have you altered your story in the moment when you realize it's not landing well? And that is an awesome question. I'm going to be perfectly candid with you. That is something that does require mastery and confidence and comfort to be able to do, because it requires actually a number of things happening at the same time. First off, what it requires is recognizing that what you're saying is not landing with your audience. And sometimes that's actually really hard to do because it depends upon your personality of the audiences you're dealing with as well. I once did a presentation for, it was a senior executive of a major financial institution. And I was in my head being my usual compelling, engaging self and working to be able to bring facts, yes, but narrative and story and structure and compelling reason and logic. And the reaction around the room was stony faced, like literally no feedback. And if you've ever presented to an audience, I mean, normally speaking, someone in the room, hopefully several people, hopefully lots of people are looking at you and they're smiling and they're nodding. And to a certain extent, we do that as audience members because we know the pain of speaking and we know the challenge. Like speaking in public, people would actually rather die than speak in public. It is the single greatest fear over death that human beings believe that they can actually face. And so we look for those nonverbal cues to be able to say, we are bringing them along and it is landing and they are getting it and they're subtly encouraging and willing us along. And so when you get no reaction whatsoever, it's like, okay, what have I done? Now, what was really interesting about this particular audience, the executives in a financial institution, is they were all massively introverted. They were huge introverted thinkers. So they were like, INTJ, or most of them were IST something. And they don't show emotion. They are the closest to what is driven by logic and reason. And what was really interesting was I had a number of them come up after the presentation and say how wonderful and compelling it was. And yet I would have no idea in the middle of it that was actually how it was being perceived. And so part of it is you need to actually be able to know and read your audience and be able to say, are they actually coming along with me or not? And then the challenge with that is you need to be able to make the strategic choice of, what do I need to do about this? So you need to know where you're starting and where you're going. You absolutely need to be able to know the outcome that you're trying to get to. Ideally, if you've actually gone through the design process and you've thought about and crafted your story, what was left on the drawing room floor by the time that you were done was a bunch of other narrative structures that you didn't choose in favor of the one that you did. And that is a resource to you, because then you can pick one of those up and dust it off and say, maybe this one will be better. And then you've got to decide, do I have the confidence to actually make a shift and shift gears? And it's okay to be able to do that. And I want to give you, with caution, permission to be able to do that, because it actually can be hugely valuable for you in terms of doing that. I have had instances where And I wouldn't pretend that it wasn't happening. I would actually acknowledge and recognize the moment. Say, you know what? I don't think this is working the way I had hoped it was. Let me shift gears. I will actually signal I'm shifting my storytelling style. And either I have the materials or I don't to be able to do that. And so there haven't been many, but there have been times where literally I have blanked out my presentation. I've turned off the projector. I've said, let's start over again. Let me take you through a different way. And that can actually be a hugely powerful thing to do, because what you're doing for them is you're communicating, I understand you. I have empathy for you. I have enough awareness to be able to recognize what I was doing wasn't working. And I have enough respect for you to change what I'm doing to be able to have it work more effectively. It's a high risk move, but it can be a high risk move with some massive, massive payoffs. All right. Another question from Paul Allen. You said we're hardwired to respond to stories. Is there a reason for this? Is there some benefit from an evolutionary perspective? Great question. And actually, the short answer to that is yes. And the reason for that is it's how we remember. Prior to us having written communication, the way that knowledge was passed down, the way that wisdom was passed down, the way still in traditional indigenous populations today, knowledge is passed down is through stories. And it's the way that we both convey it, but it's also the way that we remember it. So being hardwired for story, having that structure, having that embedding of structure is fundamental in terms of being able to then encapsulize and save and preserve, and then continue to relate that, because at some point we'll be not the youth around the campfire taking it on board, but we're going to be the wise elder that is communicating it to other people. And so the reality that we're being hardwired for story, the reality that we are hardwired for story, is it was a survival mechanism for ourselves to be able to encode and pass on fundamental information that's absolutely necessary to be able to be aware of about the lore of whether it's our history or it's our survival strategies, or it's about everything from why do people not eat pork to why do they not mix milk and meat, for example, in other pots or whatever else, because there was a time that would kill you. And so there were stories that were built around it, rules that were built, and social conventions that were built about basically trying to actually keep you alive. And last question we got is from Dave Engelhart, because I recognize we're coming up on time here. For project report outs, our leadership is increasingly looking for an executive summary at the start of presentation to share their conclusions up front. Do you have any suggestions on how to do this effectively while still telling the story? Awesome question. Thank you for asking that. What that does is it actually ties into the rules and expectation around how we tell story. And guide in terms of effective presentation is you want to tell your audience what you're going to tell them, then you want to tell them, and then you want to tell them what you told them. And to a certain extent, I actually did that in terms of the overall setup. I gave you an expectation of where we were going to go. I had a 3-act structure, and my presentation was built into 3 fundamental sections. And if you notice those as they were going along, once I got past my opening story, I talked about communicating effectively. I talked about why story was important. And then I took you through the process of effective storytelling. The thing with that is that executive summary absolutely is probably the most of your status report that is going to get read. Often it's the only thing that's going to get read. And it is a mistake to throw that in as an offhand, to be able to just update a few words from last time. You want that to land and land well. That should be that executive summary, that 1 or 2 paragraphs right at the top. That should be where you place the most time and effort to be able to say, what do I need to convey here? Now, to the point of they want the conclusions as well, that's fair, because what you're trying to do is in that summary, tell a story where people know enough to know where this is going and what's recommended and why. And then they can look at the rest of the detail to say, and do I support that? Do I agree? Do I buy in? And that's all useful and valuable. But to be able to tell that out is entirely fair. Now, I might do something different if I was speaking out loud. I might signal part of a communication, part of a conclusion, part of an intention, and also leave stuff hanging. Because then, in the context of something relayed, I have them, because they want to know the implications behind that. They want to know how that's going to play out. And so I might play around with that, and I might actually reveal some tantalizingly while still holding back everything because I want them to pay attention to what I'm going to tell them. And with that, I think we're at time, so I'm going to stop talking and let you guys wrap up.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone joining us this evening. And yeah, that's all. Thank you.
My pleasure. It was great to be here, and I really thank you for inviting me.
Mark, thanks so much. Thanks, Amr.
Thank you, Todd.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation.